Hello, everyone, and welcome to the International Society of Cannabis Pharmacists, Advancing Roles for Cannabis Pharmacists. I am Dr. Melani Kane, Executive Director and President of the International Society of Cannabis Pharmacists, and I am very pleased to be joined with Michael Ruggiero, PharmD AAHIVP, who will be leading this discussion. It's more of a fireside chat, but we're very excited to talk about our respective roles in cannabis. And I'm going to start with just a little bio about myself. I graduated from the University of the Sciences in Philadelphia and returned back to Minnesota, where I was very fortunate to obtain a position as a cannabis pharmacist. And I'll remember very clearly the posting of the position was like titled Dispensing Pharmacist. And I thought, yeah, that's what we do. We dispense drugs. And then as I start reading about it and the description, it's like dispensing cannabis as a Schedule I, and I thought, how is this possible? So I feel like I'm very lucky to come from a state that does value the role of the pharmacist and integrate that into their medical program. So I worked in the dispensary for 3 years in Minnesota, where it was very much a pharmacist-led dosing model. The doctors would diagnose, the pharmacist would dose, and it was really a collaborative experience with the patient. I say it's kind of more of a cross between AmCare and retail, minus the insurance piece, because as we'll find out, cannabis is cash only. And then since then, I've actually transitioned away, and now I do MTM reviews, so medication therapy management with Prime Therapeutics, not cannabis related, but I do work with patients in states that are adult use legal or recreationally available, as well as medical cannabis patients. So it's interesting to see how long it takes them to feel comfortable to share that they use cannabis-based medicines for their symptoms or whatever it may be. And then, of course, founded the International Society of Cannabis Pharmacists. So really as an intention to bring pharmacists together as the drug experts. This is really a drug like anything else that we'll find, and treating it and respecting it as such, not just as a molecule of impairment or intoxication, but really a molecule with therapeutic advancement and intentions in that regard. So with that, I will have Dr. Michael Ruggiero introduce himself. Mike?
How's it going, everyone? My name is Mike Ruggiero. I graduated from Philadelphia College of Pharmacy from the University of Sciences in 2016 with Melani. We were classmates, and little did I expect this is what we'd be doing a few years later. Following graduation, I worked mainly in retail, but during that time, I was always obsessed with information, so I was always learning new things. In my downtime, which was often hard to get, I became certified in HIV, as that was always a passion of mine, and I incorporated that into my over-the-counter consultations and my patient interactions. Eventually, after working in retail for about 2 years or so, I kept getting questions about CBD, and that really piqued my interest, and I didn't like not knowing about what CBD did and how it worked. So that's why I actually got certified in cannabis, namely not necessarily because of THC, but because of CBD, and that opened up a lot more doors. Once I realized how complex the molecules were, I accidentally stumbled upon a job at a dispensary because I ended up calling my friend and be like, hey, just so you know, Victoza is now indicated for children, because she always got the weirdest questions at her retail location. She's like, hey, guess what? Tomorrow's my last day. I'm like, where are you going? She's like, cannabis. I'm like, oh, well, I'm certified. I had an interview in 10 minutes. And I've been working in cannabis for just about 2.5 years. I am obsessed with information and learning. To me, staying stagnant is just kind of boring. And I also consider myself more so a generalist. I don't really enjoy being a specialist, which is part of the reason really why I like HIV so much, because HIV has applications to so many other conditions and affects so many other disease states. Like it affects the heart, liver, kidneys, brain, etc. But that's a separate conversation for another day. We're here to talk about cannabis, but that does actually have applications to cannabis, as I'll definitely be touching on later. And since working in cannabis, I've learned so much, and I honestly only feel like I know 10% of what I need to know. because there's a lack of education across the board. Besides cannabis and HIV, I'm also certified in medication therapy management, which is also something that we need to utilize within a dispensary practice. And much like Melanie said, it's kind of like a hybrid of AmCare with retail. So there's a lot you can do, and there's not necessarily all these strict boundaries. So if there's something that you really like, we can talk about how to potentially incorporate that, as I have.
Awesome. And our obligatory disclosure statement, because this is accredited for 2 continuing education hours in conjunction with the article portion. So you watch this pre-recorded webinar, and then you'll also read the article, and there are 10 post-test questions that you'll need to complete, ceimpact.com. And our disclosures are posted here. CE Impact has taken appropriate action for conflict resolution, including external peer review. And my obligatory cannabis is not FDA approved for any condition and is therefore presented here under investigational use only. This information is not intended to replace an individualized consultation with a qualified healthcare professional, but I do see more and more of those qualified healthcare professionals popping up. So thank you to all those that have put their license on the line. So in this discussion, I really want to give a detailed overview, if that's possible, of what your daily responsibilities are like in a medical state like Pennsylvania, where you do have pharmacist involvement in the dispensaries. And we can kind of compare it to Minnesota as well, just with my previous experience. But Dr. Ruggiero, would you like to start off? What is a typical day in the dispensary like for you, if that's possible?
Every day is very different. Like yesterday was very, very busy for me, but let's take a step back and talk about kind of like the whole setup. When you come into a dispensary in Pennsylvania, you cannot come in without a medical card as a patient, and we'll describe that process a little bit later. But what the process looks like, the patient will come in, they'll put their medical card, they'll get scanned into the system. Now, the system consists, at least where I am at, I know every dispensary in Pennsylvania is like slightly has different ways they operate, but we have a platform in which I guess the retail operations are managed through, and the patients are added into that. The next step is I will then take the patient's ID number. So the patient, as far as when they're getting added in, their card has a separate number, and then their account associated with their certification through the Pennsylvania Department of Health has another number. I will take the number associated with the ID in the Pennsylvania Department of Health, put that into a separate website through the Pennsylvania Department of Health, put the patient's last name, and then put the patient's birthday. That'll pull up their profile. I can see any of their active certifications with their medical cards. If it's expired, if it's pending, or if it's active. I can then click through that, see their indication, their provider, if they have a caregiver. We'll go through a lot of those different intricacies a little bit later. But the big important thing that I get at the very end is if there are restrictions. If the patient has restrictions on what certain products they can get. Physicians can put recommendations, but that doesn't mean the patient actually has to go with it. There's a lot of autonomy involved. But if the physician says no vaping, that means no flower or your typical bud for vaporization. That means no vape cartridges whatsoever. So anything that's typically geared towards that, the patient cannot receive. And that's kind of where the basis of the job is at the core level for legality purposes. The next bit that is core in terms of the pharmacist role is consultations. Now, as a pharmacist and as all healthcare professionals, I think we all need to keep psychology actually as almost like a background consideration. I actually look at psychiatry as a background disease state. So you know how to navigate the patients, but being very emotionally intelligent in these consultations is highly important because the patient has autonomy. And if you don't know how to appropriately navigate a conversation, not necessarily with someone who's PTSD, who's a rape victim, you need to know how to navigate that without triggering them. And that's really, really important. Now, the autonomy, you're not necessarily going to get into these deep conversations on the floor in which the patient is purchasing their meds. So when the patient comes into the dispensary, they have the option to either speak with me or go directly make their purchase. Now, let's say if they make their purchase directly, They don't even necessarily need to speak with me at that point. Sometimes some dispensaries force the patients or require the patients to have a formal consult with the pharmacist, but not always. So the patient can then go immediately to the register and have a patient consultant or bud tender ring them out. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean where the whole interaction ends. I'm really blessed in a way to have a amazing team. So I have a lot of informal consults on the medicine floor. So if I'm in my office or if I'm on the medicine floor where all the products are being brought to the patients, granted these products are prepackaged. There's no jars involved. Everything's already made by the separate grower processor, which is effectively like your pharmaceutical company like Pfizer. So that's all pre-packed. Now, if the patient has medical questions or if they're a new patient, my team is really great about asking, do you take medications? Do you have a specific thing that they're going to be treating? Now, if that conversation goes to medical and above their heads, they will grab me and we'll have a more informal discussion. So I won't necessarily we won't be talking about very sensitive things like like specific aspects of the patient's trauma on the med floor. But if we were to have a formal consult, that may come up, which is why it's extremely important to keep that emotional intelligence at the forefront and know how to navigate those conversations appropriately. The patient will then receive their medication and then they can leave the dispensary as follows. Now, again, everything in this context is autonomy based. So how I like to walk through my personal style of doing a consult, I like to blend my MTM in there, but it's not going to be quite like your typical comprehensive medication review. So I like to start off with getting the past medical history and I get the meds first. So what I do there, and I'm assessing for safety, are there any medical conditions that might impact THC and CBD? Are there any drug interactions I need to be worried about? And then during that time, I'm also assessing for drug therapy problems. Now, the focus is going to be on ultimately the cannabis. So I need to really prioritize the conversation and the time because I don't want to take up too much time for the patient. And also at the same time, while I'm doing that, I need to be checking the certifications for the other patients walking into the dispensary. So being cognizant and communicating with the patient as well. Hey, as patients come in, I'm listening to you, I'm taking notes, I hear you, but I also need to be doing this at the same time. So if it seems like I'm not listening, I am. Just bear with me. So having that open communication is also really key. The next step in the process for me, I'm saying for me because everyone could do this differently. I like to ask about the patient's experience. So how much have they consumed in the last month? What is their consuming style like? So if you haven't consumed in over a month, I treat you like you're treatment naive. And we kind of start from square one and we slowly work our way up. Now, how do I assess for tolerance? There's no real way to do that. At least evidence-based. So my way of doing it to try and get some sort of feel for it is I ask the patients what their preferred form of consumption is. So if they say flower, I'm going to ask, how long does it take you to go through an eighth? If it's in a few days, I'm going to treat them like they're high tolerance. If it's a week or two, intermediate. If it's over a month, I'm going to treat them like low tolerance. Is that necessarily the best way? No, but this is kind of how I decided to create a strategy that where I can hopefully mitigate any harms to the patient and also make their experience better. Now, if I'm going with an edible though, I undershoot. If I'm going to go from vaping to an edible because the metabolite that you get from ingesting an edible is more potent, I might go a little under than what I'm used to. But when I'm doing that interaction too, I'm prefacing that the patient, your genetics plays a role. Because if you don't have a high expression of CYP2C9, you're not going to get as much of a conversion of THC to that active metabolite, the 11-hydroxy metabolite, which is going to make you feel euphoria. So I also like to preface that. So always keeping expectations involved, setting expectations with the patient. After that, I talk about goals with the patient. What are your goals? What are you trying to treat exactly? When we talk about pain, what's the pain scale? Is it intermittent? Is it throughout the day? And I'm using that information to select various dosage forms. And then I close off with my recommendation. But at the same point, during that conversation, checking with the patient, how do you feel about this? And my line is, if you don't like what I'm saying, I don't have an ego. So I'm not going to be upset if you don't want this. So tell me in the conversation so we can appropriately adjust to your needs. Now, education's a massive part of this. And I often don't get enough time to do the education I want in this interaction. If I did, it would take a lot longer. So how I've decided to navigate is I have the patient's emails for the most part. So I will then email them instructions of how to dose the product, how to titrate it up. I will send them informational handouts. I might even send them a video, one that I may or may not have already done, that is on YouTube, so that they can go through everything they need to know. And I also preface that it's going to be a lot of information, but they need to take what they need and use that to empower themselves, because the reality is throughout the program, there's a lot of misinformation. The better I can arm them with that, the better they can actually get what they need out of the process.
Excellent. There's so much. It's hard to imagine having such an autonomy with, product selection when traditionally in medicine, the doctor puts down the dose, puts down the name of the drug, the frequency, and the pharmacy fills it. And I feel like, not to degrade retail work in any sense, shape, or form, but there just isn't enough time to complete that proper counseling and interaction. And even in the dispensary setting, you kind of hinted to it as well, like pharmacists are expensive. We don't have this unlimited time as a resource to counsel and educate patients on product use and storage and handling. And there's just so much to cover in such a short amount of time. And for a lot of these patients, they've never encountered these types of medicines before. So just to kind of do our viewers a favor, THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, that's the mind-altering chemical. That's the one that we're a little bit more careful about. And then CBD or cannabidiol, that's the one that we traditionally see for like seizures, and we use it to help alleviate or mitigate any of the THC-induced mind-altering effects. So it definitely has a place clinically, but also from a safety perspective as well. So I think it's very interesting to see that how patients over time respond to these molecules, especially, and I know, just kind of going back to what you said, with the like using it, I don't want to say illegally, because of course we don't condone that, but those that maybe have previous experience from another legal state, they might not actually know what they're getting. And so trying to, give it a milligrams, it's like you can't look at a coffee bean and tell me how many milligrams of caffeine are in that bean. It's not intuitive. It's not something we can easily look at, but we're trying, and I think that's the first step. I'm going to talk about Minnesota's responsibilities for a moment. We are very similar in the sense that we have pharmacists providing that consultation piece, really providing oversight and guidance for initial patients as well as those that are returning for a follow-up to really optimize their medication regimen. I think one of the differences, the key differences with Minnesota and other states, is that my state is very strict on collecting data. So every dispensation, before the first fill and before every refill, we collect baseline demographic information, so baseline medical conditions, medications. And then we also have a 0 through 10 numerical rating scale of their nausea, pain, fatigue, their quality of life. And a lot of these questions are, I think it's the same 8 questions for everyone. But then if you have a more specific like qualifying condition like glaucoma, we're going to want to know what your like baseline IOP is and if there are any positive changes as a result. Because as we'll find out, one of the biggest challenges with cannabis is the lack of robust clinical trials. So we don't have thousands of participants in a clinical trial with a control, like a placebo control, to actually determine like most effective dose. What are the actual like ranges that people can respond to, because it's so varied. And just like Dr. Ruggiero mentioned, like it's such a personalized piece. You can have 10 people coming in with chronic pain, but what is chronic pain? Is it nerve pain, bone pain, joint pain? Is it, emotional pain? That's kind of how I look at PTSD. And I think more and more states are adopting PTSD as a qualifying condition, but states can choose because there's no federal oversight besides, do your best to not, make this attractive to children, and, different rules to ensure that states are following those federal guidelines. I think we talk about it a little bit in the article about the Cole memo, but I'll have you read about it on your own time while we have this time. So the other things, Dr. Ruggiero talked about like tolerance and building that up. And I think that's very challenging because people are paying cash for this. And so you want to make a recommendation that's safe and effective and affordable. So you're kind of dealing with a few different pieces, and working with patients to kind of meet them halfway. I think both of our states, Minnesota and Pennsylvania, have a 30-day limit on quantity dispensing. I'll have you chime in on that if that's correct or not. But
they're allowing for 90 days because of COVID.
Well, thank goodness, because I had some people driving like 3 hours one way to pick up their medicines, and and I should mention, we have very different programs. You guys have quite the few dispensaries. For like 4 or 5 years, we only had 8 total in the state, led by 2 vertically integrated companies. And now we're slowly starting to expand that. So, and I think it just reflects like the society, I don't want to say societal pressure, but the stigma is easing. People are understanding its value as a therapeutic medicine. And I think it really helped having Epidiolex pass as an FDA approved drug for pediatric epilepsies. I think before then, there was this huge concern of how can you control a plant? And it's not easy by all means. But I think once you work with these plant-based medicines, you have an understanding of, how people react to it, how their bodies react to it, how the plant itself can behave. And that really helps with that direct insight, how to counsel appropriately. Next, let's talk about local oversight. So we kind of touched on this already. I'll go first. So with Minnesota, we have the Office of Medical Cannabis, which everybody in the industry calls the OMC, and they're run under the Department of Health, I believe the Board of Medicine. So they are the ones that determine which qualifying conditions we will be able to see in the dispensaries. They're also the ones that provide oversight and certification for patients, caregivers, physicians, of course. Not every doctor can prescribe. In Minnesota, it's free. There's no required course of education or anything like that. You just sign up online. And I think the other challenge is there's no like central repository of all the certifying physicians. So it makes it a little bit harder for patients to get into the program. And then the OMC also oversees like the registration piece of patients. So they collect the money to then fund the program. And we have like a patient registry. I liken it to the PDMP, but for Schedule 1. So the PDMP per our Minnesota rules is, I believe all rules, it's Schedule 2 through 5. So we can't include cannabis in there as it's still Schedule 1. But having that registry kind of helps us keep track of, product dispensation across the dispensaries, across the state. It also has like a central place for us to put notes. So if I want to discuss with my peers, potential concerns, regulatory safety, whatever it may be, it's a way to communicate for that specific patient, and the patient can see it. So it is visible to the patient. And then additionally, the OMC also has like public petitions that they accept. I believe it's just once a year, but in order to get new dosage forms or new qualifying conditions added. So right now, they are discussing adding anxiety, which honestly, people keep asking me if it's going to get approved. I have no idea. I think anxiety is one of those difficult things. Like for some people, cannabis can alleviate their anxiety. It's anxiolytic. And for others, the THC is anxiogenic. So it really depends. I have no idea which way it's going to go. And as we'll find out in the challenges piece of this conversation, there's no one studying this. We don't have like, oh, the incidence of anxiety with produced by THC is 14%. We don't have that luxury, and just that personalization piece. Everybody responds differently. So, Dr. Ruggiero, tell us about the oversight in Pennsylvania.
Well, the oversight's namely done through Pennsylvania's Department of Health. And I'm going to be piggybacking back to anxiety very, very quickly. So the process looks like this. In order to actually be a provider or a pharmacist, anybody working within the Pennsylvania's medical marijuana program, you have to take a mandatory 4-hour CE course. In my opinion, 4 hours is not remotely enough. I can tell you that when I walked into my dispensary after doing that course, I literally told my team, hey guys, I know some stuff, but I'm still learning too. And you guys may know more than me in certain areas, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to look it up. Thankfully, I'm privileged enough to have PubMed access due to a great professional network I have. So if I had questions, I would go look for what I can get to answer the questions I don't have answers to. And that's how I kind of developed rapport with my team. Now, the patient, to get certified, all they have to do is kind of go to the Pennsylvania Department of Health website, fill out some information to be a patient within the program. You have to be a Pennsylvania state resident and put in the information exactly how it's listed on your Pennsylvania state ID. After that, you pay a fee. Then you need to go see a certifying provider. There is a central repository in Pennsylvania's program where you can find providers. You can also ask the dispensary worker if they know of any physicians. I get calls regularly for that on a day-to-day basis. And then after the doctor certifies you and submits your information to the Department of Health, your medical card will come in the mail, and then you can go pick up your medication. Now, the thing is that when I'm checking my patients, like I said before, when I would put the patient information in on the separate platform that I utilize to the Department of Health website, I can actually put notes in there. But the reality is, if a patient gets a new card, any note I have under that previous card about my interaction won't be seen unless I click under it. So if I'm checking the patient's most recent card and I have a note on the first card they had, which may be 2 years ago, no one's going to see that information. Often the other issue is a lot of times the providers don't provide patient medications in there. Sometimes I'll even see notes, check for drug interactions with the patient's primary care physician's medications, which is a massive challenge within the program, because a lot of times patients come in like, hey, has anyone checked for drug interactions? And people are like, oh, my doctor did. And then I see the note that says check for drug interactions with patients' medications. So that there's often barriers that come from that. We do have an approved indication. We have 23 approved indications in Pennsylvania. One of those is anxiety. And it's tricky with that, as Melanie was alluding to, because sometimes cannabis can worsen anxiety for patients. And that's why it's really important to make sure you are educating your staff appropriately, because you're not going to be there for every interaction. Yes, THC can promote anxiety, but there's other ways to mitigate that with cannabis, such as mixing CBD in. So if my patient doesn't want to get flower that's half CBD, half THC, my way of kind of, I guess, selling that to them to reduce their anxiety is to get THC dominant flower for vaporization and mixing that in with a little bit of CBD flower to kind of curb those negative effects, or having conversations about it, other cannabinoids to look out for. In addition, setting the expectation with the patient is going to be the biggest thing here. And I guess educating across the board, because as far as oversight goes and pharmacist involvement, I guess you can say there's a lot more infrastructure that could be built, and that kind of builds into our next topic of discussion, which is going to be the challenges associated with the program. If Melanie, if you'd like to chime in.
Oh, so many. So the fact that it's a Schedule 1, I think, is the greatest handcuff behind her back, because I think it really instills a fear that, this has no medical purpose, and it is, a high risk of abuse. And I think there's just so much information out there that conflicts or contradicts this. The fact that over 30 states have some type of medical program, and just the double digits of states that have this as a recreational or adult use product, clearly it can be used safely and effectively, but the federal government still doesn't see it that way, or internationally as well. I think our hands are also tied internationally. But when you have a Schedule 1, it makes it really difficult to study and test these products. And I think that lack of oversight is really the greatest challenge from a clinician standpoint. One of the key components to each medical state or adult use state is having the ability to test your products correctly. But even then, there's products in the standardization of these testing platforms, and they I'm fucking blanking. There's there's challenges with the testing piece, the regulatory. Each state has different rules, and in terms of like what they need to test. So I don't think we actually covered it in the article, but when you have a plant-based medicine that's grown in the ground, especially cannabis, it's going to pull all the contaminants from the soil into the medicine, into the plant. So now not only are you dealing with potential heavy metal contamination from the soil, but through the processing, through the concentration, the concentrating piece of it, you're heavily increasing the concentration of these potential heavy metals. And if they're not being tested, some states don't, some states do not test this. Or if it's grown under the field of pesticides, like that will also get heavily concentrated. And some of them are more dangerous than others. And I think if we don't know what to look for, we're not going to get there. And just thinking about like how difficult these products can be, look at EVALI, the electronic vaporizer associated lung injury. It started before COVID, and I think because of the coronavirus, it's kind of fallen off. Whether or not it's still happening or not, we don't really know. But was it a contaminated vitamin E tocopherol product? Was it something from the device itself? A lot of these devices are coming from China. They're unregulated. We have no idea if there's any leaching going on with those heavy metals from the battery, with the plastic that they're using. There's just so many unknowns, and it's difficult to get the funding to test this effectively. Some other challenges with plant-based medicine is you can never control the environment 100%. So the soil composition, how many nutrients are in the soil, the light, the air, like the water, all of this, the genetics can ultimately affect the final medicine in the plant. And unless you're testing it, you're not going to be able to provide a clean and consistent medicine. And that's what people need. If you finally find something that works for your neuropathy, and one batch differs from the next, it's very frustrating. That's not something we're used to in the pharmacy. And I think because of that challenge, and again, each state is different, don't get me wrong. I don't want to say that every medical program, differs batch to batch, but even in one state, you can have these variations. And, if something happens, like these are not these billion-dollar manufacturers that can just pump out drug immediately because it's being synthesized in the lab. You have to wait for the growth cycle. And so if there is a shortage, patients feel that. And, you're in a position where it's very uncomfortable. And, I think we try to do what we can to diligently make the recommendations to ensure that patients are on the products they need. But with plant-based medicine, there's too many unknowns. Dr. Ruggiero, what are some other challenges that you find on a daily basis in your dispensary setting?
I guess I want to piggyback off of that point you made, because there's so many different avenues that we can go underneath. So strain, but more appropriately called cultivar variety is going to be key, and cultivar is going, yeah, so we want to keep that in mind, because there's no such thing as strains in botany. We call them varieties, you can call them cultivars, you can call them chemovars, but That's a separate conversation for another day. I don't want to get too off topic here, but the geography is going to play a big role as to how it's going to make up the product effect. So I tell patients, like, don't look at the strain or cultivar as what's going to help your pain or your anxiety, because guess what you got in California is going to be different than what you're getting in Pennsylvania, and even what you're getting in Pennsylvania may also be what's different in Pennsylvania. For example, we have 2 different Pineapple Express cultivars in Pennsylvania. One grower has between about 3 to 7% THCV in it, which is pretty incredible. And THCV is going to have some quite altering effects on how impactful THC can be. But the other cultivar has no THCV. So I tell the patients to kind of use the product chemical composition to navigate. However, again, like what Melanie was alluding to with the product variety in terms of the chemical composition, the availability of the testing for various molecules is going to be limited. I'm really lucky because in my program, I can have up to 10 compounds or more being tested for and seen on the labeling. Now, the labeling is going to be next in this TED Talk. But the thing is that also leaves a major blind spot in plant-based medicine. Why? Because there's over 500 different compounds in the plant. So if you get a product that you really like, I tell the patients, keep the box. If you get a product that you really dislike, I tell my patients, keep the box. And look for trends in those in terms of the chemical composition. That way they can navigate. However, the massive blind spot is in the products that you really like, there may be components that aren't being tested for or don't even have a name yet, which is enhancing the positive effects. And the same thing can be said for the products that you dislike. There may be a component that doesn't have a name that is worsening the effects that you dislike. Now, labeling is also quite the conundrum because I'll have patients coming to me with CBD products from over the counter from different states, and this patient said, "Oh, I took 2,500 milligrams of CBD in one gummy." I'm like, that's not possible, because the highest dose of CBD ever given is 6,000 milligrams. That same patient showed me a bottle that said 50,000 milligrams. And she's like, I took 50,000. Like, there's going to be errors in the math there because a lot of times healthcare professionals don't often play a role in those labeling, namely pharmacists. Now, in Pennsylvania's program, we have different dosage forms. So we have capsules, tinctures, oral syringes. The oral syringes are going to be either in a tanker base, which would be a distillate syringe, and then we'll also have Rick Simpson oils. And Rick Simpson oils contain the whole plant matter. And typically we use ethanol-based extraction to make that, which creates key differences there. We also have flour for vaporization. We have vaporization cartridges. We have topicals. And we have suppositories. And each of those have their own separate challenges. But for now, I really want to focus on the tinctures because that's kind of where I made my own in the program. So when I first started in the program, I was very frustrated because I had my team telling me, "Oh yeah, my mom takes a half a milliliter of the Shine 1-to-1. It works great for her, and she takes a full milliliter of the Soothe 5-to-1 THC to CBD, and that works great for her." I'm like, okay, what's the concentration? I have no idea what's going on here. What are they getting in terms of dose of CBD and THC? And thankfully the growers in the program are getting a little bit better about this, but what's often happens is that the amount is expressed in potency. So what happens is that, let's say if it says 1% THC in terms of like the bottle, that doesn't tell me anything. So how you have to do that is you have to move the decimal over and then convert using the density of the base that you're using. Typically in Pennsylvania, you have MCT oil, medium chain triglyceride oil. What's that? So what are our main 3 medium chain triglycerides? We have coconut oil, olive oil, and if you're bougie, avocado oil, but you're not going to see that because no one wants to spend the money for avocado oil. So you normally see olive or coconut, and that'll be on the labeling. So I use the density for that 0.94. Now there's a range and it's not perfect, but I use that to do my math and convert over. The patients aren't going to want to do that. the bud tenders or patient consultants aren't going to know how to do that. And even I didn't even know how to do that in the beginning. I had no idea what was going on, and I had to ask questions and do the digging. And if you're a patient trying to treat something, you're not going to know. I never ever tell patient to dose anything in drops because I don't really know how to quantify a drop. Because as we know, especially working in retail, drops have different densities depending on the base that we're using. I like to be very specific and precise, or as precise as possible in the program. Also, taking these things with or without food plays a big deal. So misinformation and education is then the next massive challenge, and that's across the board here. I'm talking between healthcare professionals, including pharmacists, certifying physicians, other healthcare professionals working in the program. I'm talking about the bud tenders or the patient consultants, and I'm talking about the patients themselves. And where are they getting this information from? Often the resources used aren't necessarily the best. Going on Leafly and Reddit are often the main places where patients seek information. I have patients like, oh, I did my research. I researched the strains, and BioJesus is gonna be the best one for this. And I'm like, that's not quite how this works. And then we have to have a conversation outlining some of what I just previously said. I will often refer them to more patient-friendly but more evidence-based resources. And then also providing appropriate, I guess, navigation for them, and the information is going to be always key. So at the end of the day, especially if you're a pharmacist working in this program, knowing to tactfully provide information is going to be key. You're going to get a lot of resistance from patients too. I like to think I'm very good at navigating tough situations. I've never actually had a complaint in a retail setting. I've been working in retail for over 10 years. I'm pretty good at navigating harassment and the aggression. But I had a patient say about me after I walked away, after just simply having a friendly conversation. And my consultant pulled me in. He said, just because you're the smartest person in the room doesn't make you the most likable. And I just kind of like laughed it off. I'm like, all right, that's not my trauma. That's your damage. I hope you have a great day. But you're going to come across that and knowing how to navigate that. So how do you enter conversations with patients that are more adult use? Using fun information that they might want to know. For example, with women's health, something I have often put at the forefront of my conversations because it's not talked about, and women are often shamed for it because society, but that's again another conversation. But your estrogen levels as a woman is going to play a large role, or if you were assigned female at birth, I'm sorry, because I have a lot of transgender or non-binary patients I work with. So again, being conscious of pronouns is something you want to be considerate. But anyway, if you have a female reproductive system, like a uterus, your estrogen levels are going to directly dictate how many cannabinoid receptors you have. That's going to impact your tolerance, and that's also going to impact the withdrawal you're having. Are you taking estrogen supplementation? For example, for my trans female patients or trans feminine patients, if you're consuming via smoking, which is not legal in the program, well, that via CYP1A2 is going to metabolize the estrogen and potentially reduce the effectiveness of it. Do I have a way of quantifying that? No, but they deserve to know about the potential impact of that. So having these little conversations, especially if the patient may not really be there for a medical use, even though it says they are, you can use little tidbits of information to initiate that conversation and open a lot of doors. And that's allowed me to create a lot of very great patient connections, which I get regular emails from on a daily basis.
And I think that's one of the most rewarding pieces. I have a couple more challenges I want to talk about while we're on this slide. You mentioned drug-drug interactions. And I think as pharmacists, that is something we are very much expected to know immediately. And, kind of like you said, like we don't have great studies on extent of metabolism. And, we know that, THC is metabolized by 2C9. We know that CBD is metabolized by 2C19 and 3A4 and literally a whole bunch of others. So it's like we don't have the proper numbers in place to say, oh, okay, when you're starting CBD with this drug, you want to drop the other drug dose by 25%. We don't have that luxury. And honestly, I don't know if we ever will, until people actually start testing it. And I do recommend to our pharmacist colleagues that are interested in drug interactions to utilize the FDA approved alternatives. So for THC, that would be dronabinol or brand name Marinol, although it's also now available as a liquid Syndros. And then there's also the Epidiolex for the CBD, because that one is the purified form of cannabidiol. And the challenge in the United States is that we don't have a one-to-one. So in the 30 countries around the world, over 30 countries, they have nabiximols or Sativex or Sativex. I've heard it pronounced both ways. But with that, I actually ran a drug interaction with dronabinol and Epidiolex. And it said, because they're both cannabinoids, they have synergistic toxicity. But we know for years now, probably at least 10 years, that the CBD helps mitigate the psychoactive impairment of THC. So it's just like, be careful what you read. You have to kind of frame it in that proper mindset of, we only know so much. And then the other thing you mentioned was, and it really just ties in with, as a pharmacist, we want to be able to provide all the information to our patients, but it can be overwhelming for them. Trying to understand concentrations. We have different terms for things, So when you say tincture, I think, oh, there must be some alcohol in there, and it doesn't really sound like it. So that labeling misconception, and people do not read labels. People don't read the labels, the patient education that accompanies their products. If they did, I think we'd have much higher health literacy in this country, but we don't, and they don't. They don't, and we don't. So kind of goes hand in hand. Like, we are the educators on the front lines, and so having at least a baseline understanding of these molecules.
So I do have one patient story that I think might be useful for you guys to hear, especially when it comes, if you have an own individualized specialty that you keep up with within cannabis, like I do with HIV. So whenever I check my certifications, I see the indication. So if I see HIV as an indication, I make it a part of my practice to ask the patient. I pull them aside privately and ask what antiretroviral they are taking. Often that is met with a lot of resistance. I've been cursed at for that. And you just have to take it in stride, because that's not your trauma. The patients are dealing often may not have completely accepted their diagnosis, and that's totally okay. But one such patient I had was taking Simtuza. Now, if you're not familiar with Simtuza, it contains the protease inhibitor darunavir. It contains cobicostat, which is a booster, and it contains tenofovir amphetamide, as well as emtricitabine. Now, the two things I really care about from a drug interaction standpoint in that is going to be darunavir and cobicostat. Now, there's a drug interaction with CBD, so you can actually substantially increase CBD drug levels there via CYP3A4 inhibition, by a lot, and thereby create secondary drug interactions with CBD because you're boosting the levels. I've heard of other health professionals saying that that's a good thing because you get more out of the CBD, but if you're actually trying to find the patient's sweet spot, that kind of makes it impossible because you're going to be jumping a lot over. But that's not the point of the story. This was at the start of COVID, so I asked the patient, "Are you taking anything new as a result?" And he had backstop Delsum. Now, most drug interaction checkers won't actually come across this. And if you're really interested in HIV as far as drug interactions and want a resource, I really recommend typing in to your Google resource Liverpool HIV drug interaction checker. That'll do most of the work for you, really. But when you use that, dextromethorphan will come up as a drug interaction. So what happens is, if a patient with HIV is on one of these drugs with a protease inhibitor and a booster, or a booster really, the dextromethorphan levels will be substantially increased, and the patient from taking a standard dose will robotrip. So you'll get toxic levels of the dextromethorphan as a result of taking their HIV meds with the Delsum, which isn't something that's often talked about. That conversation I had with the patient, he had no idea. He threw it all out, and then I showed him the drug interaction checker because he loved his Simtuza. He loved that drug. It worked great for him. He was controlled on it. I had no concerns with the CD4 counts or the viral loads with cannabis. And I gave him that as a resource. And every time he comes in, he gives me ways. He's like, "Hey, Dr. Mike," and I'm like, "Hey, what's up?" So it's learn to blend your individualized specialization with where you're working, and that'll make it more of a positive impact.
I think that's one of the best parts. You don't have that one-on-one time with patients in the retail community setting, but you definitely do in a cannabis dispensary where pharmacists are utilized. So I think, and that's not something where, I don't know, I guess I graduated a little bit ago, but not really talked about in pharmacy school. So, okay, so with that, I want to talk about future considerations. So one of the things you mentioned, Dr. Ruggiero, I'm not even sure, I'm getting too comfortable with you. So one of the things you had mentioned, which kind of made me think, maybe others would like to hear this as well, but how do you foresee the role of the pharmacist evolving once states adopt more recreational legislation or regulations? Do you have any comments to that?
Yeah, I see, I guess, different platforms emerging where the healthcare professional will be linked. And so I would like to envision, I've seen some beta platforms in other countries utilizing these other platforms as well that are kind of in their early stages, where the certifying provider is linked, a pharmacist is linked, the grower is linked, and the dispensaries are linked, as well as the patients are linked. So a one-stop hub for everybody. Now, the beauty of that sort of setup is it opens up for a lot of opportunities. Now, you don't necessarily have to have that set up for these other opportunities to happen, meaning billing for MTM, and providing help that way, and doing your standard drug therapy problems, comprehensive medication reviews. Improved laboratory testing is something I would like to see. But the one thing it really would excite me as things become more legal and adult use across all states is with federal descheduling to legal, like, I guess, adult use status across the board on a federal level. That'll create more opportunities for clinical trials to be done. And that's really what excites me, because yes, this is plant-based medicine. So guess what? Our traditional phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 approach isn't necessarily going to work. So we need to adopt some hybrid models like they're doing in other countries, where you do animal testing and figure out what specific combinations of cannabinoids and terpenes work for what condition. Then you do a small phase trial of that, and then do a small phase trial for humans, and then you bring it to the public. So I'm hoping we get more of these hybrid models where we're doing these clinical trials, getting some good data to help make evidence-based decision-making, and use that to adapt to our patients. And those are the two really big things that I'm really excited and hope blow up, especially within the realm of healthcare, mixing it appropriately with with the adult use market. And it's important to remember, as a healthcare professional, legislation that was pushed at the early term of the previous century brainwashed several generations of healthcare professionals, brainwashed a whole bunch of people. And if it wasn't for the trailblazers without healthcare backgrounds, we wouldn't be here. So we need to acknowledge that. So at the same point, we all need to learn how to coexist and educate appropriately about different concerns with the cannabis and maintain that symbiotic relationship. So don't forget, especially if you're a healthcare professional, understand different risks like cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, and know how to appropriately bring that to the conversations with these individuals, so we can all help everyone for the greater good.
That's a great point. And I think, even if adult use, and using that phrasing, I think is very key, because it has obviously a different connotation and intention than like a medical program. But the medical program can't go away, because you still need to provide medicines to children. And some of the kids that I've seen that have benefited from cannabis, obviously epilepsy, but then also things like sickle cell pain. These are kids that are just unable to take PO opioids unless they're admitted into the hospital and can take IV. And I think, if we can provide them an alternative medication to control that pain and that crisis, that's huge. I think in healthcare, we're all about the bottom dollar. And I think once we do kind of transition to a more outcomes-based evaluation of our effectiveness, I think that will really change things. Can we prevent hospitalization? Can we prevent, serious adverse drug reactions? And I think that's really where cannabis plays a role. So in children, and then also in those older patients, the more mature body, where they might not feel comfortable going into a dispensary, or they do and they have no idea what they're doing, and it can be very scary. Obviously, it's not life-threatening, hence why I don't agree with its Schedule 1 status. But it can be very jarring, and I've had patients that have had that very uncomfortable dysphoria, and they don't want to try it again at all. And it kind of takes some effort to say, like, maybe we took too much THC. Even the dosing, most people understand to take a pill, but sometimes when the pain is so bad, you want to kind of double up. And if you don't have that necessary time delay between dosing, repeated dosing, and that can definitely be overwhelming for the patient's body and their mind. So I'm just seeing those types of reactions. But I do think one of the other things that is super important for just the general public would be greater methods of detection. So right now, like with urine drug screens, you're not detecting impairment or intoxication. You're just detecting previous use. And I think, because of that, it's a big reason that, people fear for their employment, or even like child custody. Like there's so many implications with our current THC testing, and it's not effective for what they're trying to prove. So I do think, like, federally or internationally, once we see that change, I think the attitudes that we have, the perceived stigma will also reduce as well. So that's something to look forward to. The last thing I wanted to talk about is just some additional resources. So I'll start with what the society is doing, ISCPH. So one thing that we find very important is, as pharmacists, we are the drug experts. And so our Quality Assurance and Patient Safety Committee is teaming together with the greater society, of course, to create patient educational handouts. And so obviously there's some risk in doing so, but just giving patients a general sense of the different formulations that are available, the different molecules, THC, CBD, who knows how many more alphabet soup letters we'll come up with. It always starts with a C or a T. And then also looking at, considerations for specific symptoms or disease states. And I think that's very important. Traditionally, our society is all about educating healthcare professionals, but, part of our job is educating patients. It's a big part. So ensuring that educational piece is there. And we've released our first one on inhalation, and it was an endeavor. And it had, I remember we opened it up to the general public, or to the society's comments, and there were over 300 comments, which is awesome. But it just kind of shows you how everybody looks at this differently, and they have their own opinions on, how to counsel patients and how to properly, reduce harm. So it's just interesting to see us coming together, because we don't have guidelines, we don't have a single source of truth to go by. And the society, of course, we're very much into education. So hence having our continuing educations that are accredited by ACPE. What other resources do you like to share with patients? And I don't just mean like the stuff that you get from the grower processors, but also, is there any other resources online or in print that you like to provide to patients?
So I actually tend to, I guess I'm putting a plug in for Canigma. I
Yeah.
actually send patients there a lot, because at least the articles are evidence-based. They have a two-step process in which healthcare professionals play a role. So in the, I guess, the development of the article and the topic, one healthcare professional will play a role, especially if they're interested in that topic, and then another will play a role in the editing of that material. So, and the way things are worded, especially if there is unclear evidence, they state that, and it's a good way of getting away from Reddit, which is where most people get their information. Leafly, weed maps, etc. I don't want people on there. It just kind of perpetuates the issue. And then I tend to actually be the main resource. I try and make sure I educate my team and to help dispel some myths. Because if it all starts one place, and then it becomes a trend, because the patients who really want that information, the patients who are really interested and really appreciate that information, they come back over and over and over and over again. Yes, I'm the most expensive person in my dispensary building, but I drive business in a different way. Patients will come back for me. Patients come back for the staff that I've educated. And we can use that to kind of bring down a lot of the misinformation that's been perpetuated by the non-healthcare professionals working in the field. However, we need to acknowledge their efforts in us getting here to begin with. So that's one big thing I do. If you don't have access to PubMed, and you regularly look up cannabis information, it might be worth looking into what's called Cannabis as a resource. We have webinars, we have information, but that's not just to say just stick with us. Get involved elsewhere. There is ACHEM, ACHEM. There is Americans for Safe Access. There's Society of Cannabis Clinicians. There's the separate nursing organizations. There's other physician organizations. Dive in, get involved. Everyone has a little bit of something to offer. And the beauty is when you combine that information, you have more of a holistic approach to work through, since not everyone's gonna be a one-stop shop for what you're looking for.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ruggiero. Please continue with part 2, which is the article. And then when you're done reading through that, use that article to help you answer the questions for the CE credits. Thank you, everyone. You guys have a great rest of your day, night, wherever you are internationally, domestically, and we thank you for joining us.
Thank you.